The desegregation of Alachua County schools is a fascinating story of how school administrators, teachers, students, and parents moved to a single unitary school system. Last week, we learned what the federal courts mandated and why. This week, we learned what happened on the ground in response to the court orders and challenges faced by the community. I'm pleased to introduce once again our speaker, Michael Gengler, author of this book, A Community Takes on the Challenge of School Desegregation. We Can Do It. He has donated this copy of his book to the Oak Hammock Library. It will be available next week. Michael graduated from Gainesville High School in 1962. I mention this again because Gainesville High School played a pivotal role in the desegregation of public schools in Alachua County in 1969-70. He received his A.B. degree from Columbia College in New York City in 1966, magna cum laude, and was elected to Phi Beta Kappa in 1969. He received his J.D. degree from Harvard Law School. Until 1974, he served as an assistant staff judge advocate in the United States Air Force. For most of his career, he was a corporate lawyer in Boston and Chicago. He also worked for a few years as a full-time volunteer lawyer for Legal Action of Wisconsin in Madison. He also worked for a few years as a full-time volunteer lawyer for Legal Action of Wisconsin in Madison, representing clients who could not afford counsel. He lives in Gainesville now and is a vocal advocate for public school education. We're happy to have him here for our ILR. Michael, it's all yours.
Well, thanks, John. And again, thank you for inviting me. And I'm very honored to speak to this group because I know that many of you are academics and many of you have strong ties to Gainesville. So let's go right into the program. Here we go. Well, I'm having a problem here. Screen sharing is paused. What do I do now?
We can see it.
Let's start over. I'm just going to start over again.
Okay.
Okay, does everybody have this now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So here we look. And I'm just going to stop on the screen for a moment because I want to call everyone's attention to the website, wecandoitbook.com. There are source documents on that site. I have put up all the legal documents from the Alachua County case, and there are a number of other documents from desegregation here, which are not publicly available. And if you want to dig into any of that, it's available on the book's website. So I want to talk today briefly about the methodology that I employed. Why did I write this book? Well, as I said last week, I became aware on a trip to Gainesville that there had been significant problems with school desegregation in Alachua County. And I'm a corporate lawyer, right? So the only methodology that I know is a legal methodology and also journalism from my role in the Columbia Daily Spectator at Columbia. In journalism, there's a distinction between hard news and opinion. In law, we have a distinction between evidence and argument. And what am I good at? Well, I'm good at investigating things. I also feel that my own opinions as a corporate lawyer, and not somebody who was directly involved in these events, would not be, I really don't consider myself qualified to express opinions on whether Lincoln High School should have been closed what the NAACP should have done, and so on and so on. So this book is largely, pretty much exclusively, a story about what happened and why it happened the way it did, explanations. I just note that I was discussing it with a historian at one point, and he is of a more advanced school of history, I guess, than I am. And he told me epistemologically, what you did is not history. History is finding some facts and making an argument. Well, I'm not making any arguments in this book. I'm just trying to explain things. So with that, let's go into the program. In 1962, I was editor of the Hurricane Herald at Gainesville High School. And we did a survey of the student body. Most of it involved teen life. But one question on the survey was, are you in favor of desegregating Gainesville High School? At that point, here we are 10 years after Brown, 8 years after Brown, sorry. And the people on the staff of the Hurricane Herald, we were liberal, we were going on to college. And the answer came back, 38% of the students favored integration and 62% were opposed. And I'm sure that if the administration had not been interested in the answer to that question, we would not have been allowed to answer the question in the first place. But anyway, it's a data point that, the good news is that there is a core of students in 1962 at Gainesville High who were in favor of desegregating the school. The bad news is 62% were opposed. In 1970, during desegregation, the editor of the Hurricane Herald at that time wrote an editorial, "We Can Do It," describing to the students the tasks that they faced and saying that the white and the African-American students can get this done, can get this desegregation done. And because I am primarily focused on the people who tried to make desegregation work and who were devoted to that ideal, that editorial naturally suggested itself to me as the title for the book. I'm not going to talk about the research. We can get into that later if there are questions. I certainly believe that history is made by the people, and this is no more true than with desegregation. We also need to recognize that different people perceive the same fact differently. And any profits from this book, which are unlikely at this point, will go to the Education Foundation of Alachua County. The main theme of today's topic is the continuing division in the African American community over whether desegregation helped or hurt the African American community. We saw in the initial case that we looked at last week, Roberts v. the City of Boston, 1849, that some African Americans had asked the school committee for separate schools. Other African Americans did not want to go to those separate schools. They wanted to go to the white schools. So the question that I asked the people that I interviewed for this book, did school desegregation help or hurt the African American community? The responses range from it destroyed the African American community to without school desegregation, we were pretty much at a dead end. Some of the people, and these were all African Americans that I asked this question of, some said that it helped the students who pursued higher education and students who became successful without college degrees, but it did not help the poor and the disengaged students. And in that connection, I recommend Eugene Robinson, Desegregation, the Splintering of Black America, which goes into all this on a much larger scale. So last week, the legal framework for de jure school segregation, issue number 1, Brown versus Board of Education, separate by law can never be equal. We examined the dispute within the African American community over whether desegregation should be pursued as a remedy. I think we realized at that point that there is no alternate universe in which separate by law could have been equal. Issue number 2, The 14th Amendment, as interpreted in Brown v. Board of Education, requires unitary school systems. In other words, not side-by-side white and black schools. The Fifth Circuit led the Supreme Court on that issue in 1966, and in 1968, the Supreme Court in the Green case followed that up and agreed that there should be no white schools, no black schools, just schools. Issue number 3, the big one, is by when. And in the Alexander case, January 1, 1970, for 33 districts in Mississippi, and Alachua County was one of districts from all across the Fifth Circuit, from Texas all the way to Georgia and Florida. And the Supreme Court in that case, which was under the name of Carter, ruled that it would be February 1, 1970. And so from that, we have all the events that transpired in connection with the desegregation into a unitary system. Again, while I still have time, I want to talk a little bit about Lincoln High School. Lincoln High School was the only black high school for Gainesville and the surrounding area. It had existential importance to the African American community. During segregation, it was the only pathway to success for African Americans. And in that connection, C. Albert White, who was a 1962 graduate of Lincoln High School and wrote the book, Lincoln High School, Its History and Legacy. And a copy of that will be in the library at Oak Hammock. The black schools were located in black communities, not miles away in white areas. It was possible for students to care for their siblings. In single-parent families, they had access to family and friends in the community, right around the schools. The high schools in particular were a unifying focus for the black community. They provided education, obviously. They provided mentors of the person's own race. They provided football, they provided homecoming, they provided commencement, which were ceremonies that unified the community around the school. Teaching in a black school offered a path to the middle class and to community leadership. Teaching techniques evolved separately in the black schools. There was in particular sensitivity to black experiences, caring for the students. The teachers were trained in the black colleges of education to do home visits to their students, get to know the families, and frequently taught Sunday school to many of the same students that they would see in class during the week. In 1964, Lincoln was one of the first black high schools in Florida to achieve full accreditation on the same footing as white schools from the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools. So let's not forget that as we go through the rest of today's program. So here we are in desegregation, blacks and white schools in Alachua County. Before 1964-65, 0. In 1964, the Wright versus Board of Public Instruction of Alachua County case was filed in the federal court. And as a result of that case, 12 black students entered the white schools in the 1964-65 academic year, 3 at Gainesville High School. 1965-66, 317, and you can see the numbers growing steadily up to 39% in 1969-70, which was the last year of freedom of choice. How did freedom of choice work for the African American students? And I'm the high points here. I would really like to share my wonderful interviews, but that time is not going to permit us to do that. We're just going to have to get the hard news here. And if you want to get the feature stories, you'll have to read the book. So one of the students told me, here's what King wants. Let's go with it and see if it works, because it was all we had. There was no conversation. The parents knew the issues and believed they had properly prepared us. And all of these students stressed that it was not they who made the decision to go to the white school. It was their parents who made the decision for them. So on the downside, we have white student harassment. There was obviously some of that. There were also white student friendships. There were limited course offerings in the black schools, in the white schools. There were courses such as calculus, lab science, languages, and advanced tracks. Some of the students who went into the white schools had academic struggles. There was also white teacher support and academic success. Isolation for some black students, others went into student government and extracurriculars. Some lost their black friends back in the neighborhood because they were in the white school. Some did not want to go to school with whites. Others accepted white students and white teachers. Many African-American teachers saw desegregation as a threat, and other black teachers were assigned to teach in the white schools and help to desegregate just by being there and by teaching both white and black students. High school sports played a big role in freedom of choice desegregation. Lincoln High School played in Class B, and the coaches there had a hard time keeping the talent in the neighborhood because Jim Nyblack, who many of us knew, was coaching at Gainesville High. Gainesville High played in Class AA. They played powerhouse teams from around the state, and he was vigorously recruiting black athletes. The black athletes at Gainesville High during freedom of choice played a role in helping to unify the school and in helping to bring the school into an accommodation with desegregation. Freedom of choice was accomplished peacefully. There were no basic changes to the white school model. Under freedom of choice, there were many different experiences. Just a couple of comments here on the interviews. Excuse me. Daphne Duval Williams was a very beloved and excellent black teacher and dean at Lincoln High School. And she is here speaking to Joel Buchanan. This is from a Joel Buchanan interview at the Samuel Proctor Oral History Project. And this is Mr. Buchanan's version of her comments to him at the time that he was deciding to go to Gainesville High School as one of the first black students there. I could be killed. I would be hurt. My life would be an open book. I would definitely fail. The pictures I had seen on television of the kids in Alabama, I was leaving friends that I had been in school with from the first grade. I would be the only black boy in a large school. And I would add that Ms. Williams, who was by then at retirement age, did retire in 1971. Here she's counseling Mr. Buchanan on the problems that he would be facing in the white school. Mr. Buchanan, continuing in his interview, there were teachers there that taught us because they had to but did not care to. But then we also had some teachers who wanted to be the first, or they selected the very best teachers for the first time because the city of Gainesville and the Alachua County School Board were determined that they were going to have a very good outcome, and they did. Mr. Buchanan went on to the University of Florida, and his student job there, as many of you probably know, was as social secretary to President Stephen O'Connell. Carmen Dukes is a daughter of John Dukes, who was the last principal of Lincoln High School and the first principal at Eastside. And she did not have such a good experience. She was, I believe, in fourth grade at Findlay and saying here, the only kids that were open to me in my class were like one girl who was from Mexico and then a guy that was from Japan. So it just wasn't a positive experience for me at all, because I went from a school where I was at the top of the class, really active in everything and outspoken. It had me to lose my self-esteem and self-confidence. And then a lot of the kids in my neighborhood, they kind of had a problem with me because they felt like I thought I was better than them because I went to another school. So here we have the Jefferson County Decree on Unitary Systems. This was substantially as proposed by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And again, here is the framework under which unitary school systems were implemented as established by the courts. And this is another turning point. Remember, we talked about Mr. Kendi's assertion that the NAACP push for desegregated public schools was racist and elitist. And we went into that at some depth last week. Here's the decree: facilities, equipment, and courses of instruction and instructional materials in the Black schools shall be of a quality equal to that in the white schools. But if for any reason it is not feasible to improve sufficiently any school formerly maintained for Negro students, such school shall be closed as soon as possible and students reassigned on the basis of freedom of choice. New schools and any substantial expansion of existing schools shall be located with the objective of eradicating the vestiges of the dual system. So what does this do? Here again, the NAACP could have said, you're going to have to go into the Black neighborhoods and upgrade all that old obsolete school plant, this inadequate school plant that you've been maintaining all these years in the segregated schools, and you're going to need to racially balance the Black schools in the same way that you're racially balancing the white schools. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund obviously did not make that choice. And we can consider whether, as Mr. Kendi said, there is an alternate universe in which equalizing the Black schools would have worked. I'm just going to point out that that choice was made. And on that basis, virtually every Black high school in Florida was either closed or repurposed, including Lincoln. There will be remedial educational programs to overcome past inadequacies. The faculties are to be desegregated, and to protect the African-American teachers, there will be no new hires unless no displaced teacher is qualified to fill the vacancy. So now we're going into the unitary system. Alachua County needed a bond issue for new schools in 1965-66. And this bond issue was defeated by the voters. But in that bond issue, remember, this is still freedom of choice. We can still have side-by-side white and Black schools. Lincoln and Mebane were to stay open for grades 7 to 12. The excess enrollment of African Americans was to go to the white schools. And we were going to build a new high school on the west side, which eventually became Buchholz. Well, after that defeat, remember, at this time, there are no schools in Alachua County other than the public schools. So poor public schools were an existential threat to this community, to the University of Florida, to the top-level economic interests, et cetera. Citizens for Public Schools was organized in October 1967. Here we have Emanuel Suter, the Dean of the College of Medicine at the University of Florida. Why do we need public schools? We have been able to hold our own with other medical schools with our salaries, but all things being equal, a professor who has a choice to make is not likely to take a job where the public school system is in trouble. So now we have unitary systems required in the Fifth Circuit. In December 1967, a new state survey of facilities in Alachua County found that race is not a factor in these recommendations. It would be impossible to work up a plan based on freedom of choice. This survey implements a unitary system for Alachua County. The school board in that plan closed Lincoln for grades 7 to 12 and closed Mebane for grades 10 to 12. And now we're going to have new high schools on the east and the west sides. The school on the east side is in what was then neutral ground out toward Noonan's Lake. And on the west side, these schools were to be built according to identical plans. No argument that the east side was being treated differently than the west side, or that African-American students were being treated differently than white students. There was freeholder approval on May 26, 1968. In the federal court case, there was a revised desegregation plan filed February 28th, 1969. The full unitary system was to be implemented in 1970-71 because of schools under construction. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund objected March 19th, 1969. They did not object to Lincoln's closing. They did not want the unitary system to be delayed. They wanted Williams and Duval elementary schools deep within Black neighborhoods to be zoned or paired with white schools so they would not be all Black. And most importantly here, for our purposes, the plan fails to show desegregation in the conversion of another Black elementary school to a Center for Elementary Reading Programs and conversion of Lincoln to a Center for Middle School Reading Programs and senior high vocational programs. Well, remember the dispute between Booker Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, whether Blacks are trained for trades or whether they're trained for higher level academic instruction. Part of the problem that the African American community had with the closure of Lincoln High School was that the school board decided to hive off these problem students. They knew there were problem students, obviously, that had disciplinary issues and that were not achieving at grade level. We're going to put them at Jones in the elementary program and at Lincoln in the middle school program and in the senior high vocational program. And this will be done on the basis of freedom of choice. And so we expect that these students will not be coming into the white schools. Well, the NAACP is onto that, the courts are onto that. When this finally went up, and I'm going to finish out the legal part of this presentation, when this issue finally went up to the Court of Appeals in the Fifth Circuit said, no, you cannot assign students to these special programs in the Black neighborhoods at the elementary and middle school level on the basis of freedom of choice. If you're going to operate those programs, then you have to assign all the eligible students in the school system to those programs at those locations. Well, at that point, the school board said, oops, we're not going to run these programs at those sites. We're going to integrate everybody into the white schools. And so the NAACP Legal Defense Fund objected to Lincoln's closing after it was closed on March 9th, 1970. And the closing was approved by the district court and the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals under the decree that we previously looked at. Here is a photo of the Lincoln strike in November and December 1969. The school virtually emptied to protest its closing. I interviewed William Robinson, who was one of the lawyers on the Alachua County case. He eventually became dean of the School of Law at the University of the District of Columbia. And I asked him, did you consider possibly delaying this desegregation to the following school year? His response, he's a civil rights warrior. We had been trying for years, if not decades, to get segregation eliminated. Postponing to the next school year never entered our mind. It was never raised, no thought was given. At the Gainesville, and let's be clear that the reason that the NAACP wanted desegregation in the middle of the school year was so that the graduating class would not be stigmatized by diplomas from their Black high schools. At the Gainesville High commencement in June 1970, virtually all of the Black students transferred from Lincoln and Mebane in that academic year chose and were allowed to receive diplomas from Lincoln and Mebane, and they wore the colors of Lincoln and Mebane. So now we're moving African American students and teachers into the unitary system. And what are some of the issues here? Well, we noticed that Lincoln High's enrollment was declining. Here in September 1965, almost 1,600. In September 1969, it was below 1,300. And the students who remained behind, as we'll see, were not necessarily of the same academic level as the students who had left Lincoln previously. In 1965, Superintendent William Talbot estimated that the sixth graders in the black schools were reading 1 to 3 years below grade level. And he thought it would be at least 10 years before they could be brought up to the grade level. Alachua County teachers passing the national teacher exam in 1965, this was a requirement for promotion, although it did not force you out if you were on a continuing contract. The white teachers, mostly every white teacher in Alachua County had passed the national teacher exam in 1965. Among the black teachers, 253 black teachers, only 50 had passed at that time. And the county did adopt a remedial program for those teachers to get them hopefully up to the level that they could pass the test, because they wanted to, and also because the county was having extreme difficulty recruiting black teachers. Senior placement test scores at Gainesville High in 1970 to 71. This would have been the people who entered Gainesville High the previous year as juniors, now are seniors. We all took the senior placement test. Everybody remembers that. 300 or better was a score that was necessary to get into a 4-year institution of higher learning, except for Florida A&M, by the way. Among the white students, 54% met the 300 or greater threshold. Blacks entering from a white junior high, 17%, and black entering from a black senior high, 3%. Now, it's important to recognize that this higher number for the African Americans entering from a white junior high isn't because they had the benefit of the white school. It's because they were smarter kids to begin with and better adjusted and more interested in pursuing academics. Desegregation in the Unitary system, what are the headlines here? There was immediate Lincoln transfer student resistance to the academic and disciplinary regime at Gainesville High. Some Lincoln High School transfer students called the Freedom of Choice Blacks Oreo cookies. Again, here we have this division continuing in the African American community. Learning deficits. In 1968-69, reading programs under Public Law 8910 funded 3,600 students in Alachua County. In 1969-70, that number was cut to 2,000, ironically just at the point where the program was most needed. There were curriculum revisions. The book goes into significant detail about how the curriculum was revised to accommodate the students who now entered the white schools from Lincoln. One of the points here, teachers, 10 teachers from Alachua County, white teachers, enrolled as students in a program for problem readers that was run at Santa Fe Junior College, because they wanted to observe the techniques that were being used by the teachers there to teach the problem readers. Remember that teachers in middle schools and high schools were not trained to teach reading, but yet they had to do it if these students were to progress at all in the desegregated schools. Disaffected white and black students found each other. There was in-school violence. There was a riot March 26, 1970. Some teachers were beaten and a white dean was very seriously injured. After that, there was sensitivity training by psychologists. I interviewed one of the psychologists. He said, you know, we really weren't prepared to do this. And there were some exchanges of views, but resolution not so much. Student government to allow the African American students an equal voice because they were in the minority at Gainesville High School. That was reformed so that there would be equal numbers of white and black senators. Sports, some Lincoln athletes did not meet the academic standards to play. GHS lost 2 popular principals in the first 2 years of the Unitary system. Some, both black and white teachers, retired after the desegregation, and others responded to changed conditions. And again, there's a lot of information about the teachers and their responses in the book. So we're in white schools now. There were only white and black schools in the South, and in the white schools, the special engagement techniques that were employed by the black teachers in the black schools were mostly lost. No one ever thought of trying to bring those techniques into the desegregated schools to benefit both races. And the white school continued to be the model for educating students of both races. There was no time to do a reboot under the circumstances of 1970. Community responses. In 1963, Charles Chestnut III, many of you know him, he served on the county commission. He formed an NAACP youth chapter and worked for desegregation largely out in the community restaurants, movie theaters, etc. The Gainesville Ministerial Association integrated in 1963 and did pulpit exchanges, again, laying the ground for a community that is going to embrace integration and try to work to help it happen. At Holy Trinity Episcopal Church, the Reverend Earl Page was an initial member of the Gainesville Biracial Committee. He used his church for Sunday night meetings of African American and white students to talk about problems of desegregation. In 1965, again, we're in freedom of choice now, Herbert Wagemaker is the team physician for Lincoln, P.K. Young, and Gainesville High. And he organized a chapter of Young Life, which is a Christian organization, not what you would consider today to be an evangelical organization, a sort of soft version of a Christian organization. Athletes of both races joined and were present there during desegregation. Other students joined. Perry McGriff and Noel McGriff were very active. You will know them as community leaders. They were active in Young Life. And it is estimated that by 1970, there were about 800 African American and white students working in Young Life, and they became leaders and helped again to make desegregation work on the campuses. In 1968, there was a teacher strike across the state. And in Alachua County, the striking white and black teachers met together. There were formerly separate unions. They, during the strike, met together and worked together. March 26, 1970, after the riot, one of the proposals was let's have some ombudsman to help to work with the students at Gainesville High School, walk the halls, meet with them. Charles Chestnut III, Earl Page, and many members of Young Life became ombudsmen and again worked on the campus of Gainesville High School with the students. Another response, spring of 1970, Oak Hall, Rolling Green, and other private or faith-based schools were founded by whites. 1970, Russell Ramsey, again without any background, he was a graduate student at that point at the University of Florida, was selected to run isolation classes for the worst disciplinary problems, white and black. He organized visits to community businesses and government to show these places to these students and hopefully to help them see that they had a future in the community, and the community opened itself to these visits. In 1970, there was a Black student union at Gainesville High School organized to advocate for Black history and culture classes, which were granted, and to act as an intermediary when there were disputes. And in March 1970, we have the new GHS principal, Dan Boyd, who eventually became superintendent. He lasted at Gainesville High for the next 26 years. They are just crying out for closer student-teacher relationships. Some teacher perspectives. A white intern at Lincoln High School, spring of 1969. I feel that the University of Florida should have given the students they sent out to Lincoln special training. We were prepared to teach at a typical middle-class white school and not the situation we were put in. May Islar, a Black principal on the UF graduate program. I can't take this. I've got college professors trying to teach me what I know they don't know a thing about, and you expect me to sit there and listen to this? Tiny Talbot, the superintendent in 1971, at a conference, making the point that teachers need to teach reading to socially promoted students. Ro Johns, a prominent University of Florida education professor, listen to this carefully, this is stunning. A good point. Accountability will have to start with teacher education. But if college professors don't know about the problem, how in the hell can the teachers teach the children? Johns to Alachua County in 1953 as a consultant. If you do not build a new Negro high school along with the white school, this was the new campus of Lincoln High School, then the Negroes can sue and get in the white school. So you have a sense of, I hope, the depth and extent of the lack of preparation for unitary systems. What happened to the Black teachers in the unitary systems? The court order for Alachua County mandated desegregation at the existing ratio of 4 white to 1 Black. The Lincoln strike settlement required the assignment of the Lincoln staff to comparable positions. In October 1968, there were 253 Black teachers in the system, 25% in the reports to the court in April 1970. And of course, there were reports in the interim. In April of 1974, despite all the issues associated with African-American teachers, both recruiting and in some cases qualifications, there were still 21%, 208 African-American teachers in the system. So it would not be accurate to say that the county fired all the Black teachers, as has been alleged. Teacher demographics, 2015 to 16, there were 81.4% white teachers, 11% Black, and the remaining other races. The county has continued to have difficulty filling those Black teacher positions, and that continues to impact the present time. I'm going to skip this. We know issues outside the schools influence the events in the schools, and the schools can't be held responsible for solving all the problems that are in the schools. They have to take, and the public schools have to take whoever shows up. From today's viewpoint, what has changed and what hasn't? Again, on the theme of did desegregation help or hurt the African-American community? At Lincoln, it was estimated that 60% of the 7th graders would continue and graduate. In 2020 in Alachua County, 84% of the African-American 9th graders eventually did graduate from high school. Higher education of African-Americans in 1970, African-Americans were only 4.3% of full-time undergraduates in formerly white institutions of higher learning in the South. And people would perhaps argue this next statistic 2 ways. In 2013, only 10% of African-Americans enrolled nationwide in undergraduate and graduate degree programs, were attending historically Black institutions. Being a nerd, in the course of my research for the book, I read every school improvement plan for Alachua County in the 2016 to 2017 academic year. At a high school, lack of foundational literacy skills, reading far below grade level, vocabulary deficiency, lack of academic stamina, confidence, and motivation, limited access to technology at home, poor attendance, and behavioral issues. At a middle school, there is a disconnect between an ever-changing diverse student population and a primarily white middle-aged teaching force. The achievement test scores for Alachua County third graders in the most recent academic year that we have statistics for, again, grade 3, a score of 3 or better is regarded as satisfactory. Here are the percentages: white 77.2%, blacks at 31.8%. 31.8% statewide is not a good number. The demographics that we're dealing with now in the public schools, white 891, again, this is third graders across the county, 2018, 2019. White 891, Hispanic 236, black 881, and so on. A little bit different statistic, which doesn't show quite as great a statistical disparity. The National Assessment of Educational Progress from Florida in 2013, which are the most recent scores by state that we have. Here you have the white and black scores. The reading grade 12, white 295, black 267. So again, all relevant facts. If you look at all relevant facts, I believe you get a balanced set of facts, a set of facts that you can argue any position from, but as I think we all recognize, it's important to have the facts before you get up and make your argument. That's true of lawyers, and I think it should be true of any public discussion. Summing up, school desegregation was reactive to court decisions. Freedom of choice led everyone to believe that historically Black public schools would continue indefinitely. That impacted institutions, obviously. The relative success of freedom of choice masked problems that would occur in the unitary systems. There was an institutional non-response. Teachers and administrators in unitary systems were unprepared to deal with issues that arose during the implementation of unitary systems. The white school became the model for schools in unitary systems. Teacher engagement practices special to the Black schools were mostly lost, and many African Americans from desegregation years believe desegregation helped. Many others believe it hurt. And perhaps I think that the methodology that I employed, again, to sum up, is helpful especially in presenting the division within the African American community, which existed throughout this history between African Americans who wanted desegregation and African Americans who preferred historically African American institutions. Okay, so that concludes my presentation. I'm going to stop sharing the screen and let's have some discussion. Questions? Deborah has her hand up. Why don't you unmute and ask your question? You need to ask to unmute. We can't hear you.
I was just checking the gallery and I didn't actually have a question, sorry.
Okay.
All right, Betty Kramer, go ahead, unmute.
I was a graduate first 40-year-old brand new teacher in 1968, and I came to Florida as a new resident. And I got a teaching certificate and started teaching at a junior high in Pinellas County. Not only had they had the teacher strike the year before, so the teachers were not happy with each other, but it was the first year, a year before Alachua County, that we integrated. And I remember coming from a northern state that the whole thing seemed chaotic to me. The Black students hung out together in the gym in a pack and carried black gloves on their sleeve, threatening for people to knock one off. It was 1 year before Alachua County. I'm surprised about that. But we closed all of our Black schools so that we didn't have anybody staying in a Black school, and they changed them to magnet schools. So that's it.
Stunned silence. Yes, Michelle, please. Does someone want to recognize Michelle?
I don't see Michelle, but
This is just a comment. We moved down to Gainesville in 1971, knowing none of this background at all, because we didn't have newspapers or the internet to learn all of that. My daughter went to J.J. Finley in first grade, and she made friends with everybody because we didn't know of all this background. But in 1972, at the University of Florida, the student body president was elected, and he was a young Black man. And his picture was in the paper with his mother. His mother happened to be my daughter's teacher. And she looked at the picture and she said, I can't remember the young kid's name, Mrs. Jones, I didn't know she was Black. And she had been in class for, for 6 or 7 months at that time. And she said, I never knew she was Black. It was just, it stunned us because it will show for many young kids, if they aren't taught to be disrespectful or to notice that other people have different skins, and that's about all. You know, it comes a lot from the parents who have had to grow up in this situation. And we're very proud of her. She grew up to be a normal kid, but was picked on a lot because she had red hair and freckles.
Yes, and I know the person that you're speaking of, and his name is slipping my mind also right now, but he did give an interview to the University of Florida at the time that desegregation happened. And it's basically, I just put it verbatim into the book. It's a very interesting commentary from someone who was a pioneer of desegregation. Right. And his comments on the Black schools and the problems that existed there.
Right.
thank you. Barbara, go ahead.
I want to thank you for presenting the complexities of the situation. I mean, they were enormous. I wonder if you interviewed any white parents in terms of their experience. I will tell you that my son went to Littlewood Elementary starting in 1972, which had been integrated. When he hit the second grade, he had an African-American teacher, very sweet woman. The notes that came home from her were filled with grammatical errors. And it really posed a quandary for me and my husband. We had fought for integration. We believed in integration. And here our son was being exposed to a teacher who would have failed that national exam. So we thought about it and we decided that we would keep him in the class. But at the end of the year, we went with all the notes we had collected to the principal of Littlewood and said, look, we understand this situation is terribly difficult, but you have to make sure that next year John has a teacher that can make up for this deficit. And I wasn't the only white parent who had that kind of experience and faced a very difficult quandary. So I'm wondering whether you interviewed any white parents in terms of their reaction to the integration of the schools and the teachers.
Well, I didn't, but I can tell you that I did interview the Reverend Wright, who brought the case on behalf of the
Right.
NAACP. And he told me that some of the Black teachers were members of his church, and they had been let go. And he went to see Mr. Talbot about this, as he would, right? And Mr. Talbot told him that there were some parents who observed these classes of these teachers. And if you read some of their comments, you would agree that they were some pretty poor teachers. And Reverend Wright read those comments and went back and told the teachers who were members of his church that they should just forget about it.
Mm-hmm.
So again, was the system being racist, or was it accommodating to the situation? That was Reverend Wright's action in that particular situation. But no, I didn't. I interviewed a lot of students. I did not interview parents, and quite honestly, the students were focusing on many other issues besides Black teachers in their interviews.
Thank you, Rick. Go ahead.
Thank you. You mentioned the conflict between W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington over vocational versus academic objectives of the public schools. Of course, they had many other issues that they had conflicts over. But when you looked at the overall assessment of the success or failure of this process, did you take into account in any way the solidarity of the Black community, the development of African American leaders, what this did to the Black community as a whole?
Thank you. Were you present for last week's discussion?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so you saw the development of the advocates for and against desegregation as a strategy to remedy the situation of desegregation. And I would say that is the principal area that I investigated and researched in connection with the book. I mean, I wasn't going into, there's a lot of books that I read in the bibliography, but as far as that conflict, it's not something that I focused on in the book. I wanted to show what happened. Again, I was looking at all the relevant facts. And in fact, what I found was this division, that there was not, in fact, solidarity, that there were African Americans who favored desegregation and perhaps assimilation as a result of that. And there were others who came out of Lincoln High School who were very much opposed to that, who were in favor of Black power and followed that train of thought, which was then present. I did not find solidarity. Certainly, I think one of the main lessons that we can learn from this book, if there are any there at all, is that there was not solidarity throughout the course of this legal dispute going all the way back to the city of Boston in 1849.
Okay, Alice, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk today. situation, the current situation really saddens me. And I'm wondering from your perspective of having looked at all of this data, do you have thoughts about what the 2 or 3 most important things are that we should be doing today to make improvements?
I'm sorry, I'm laughing. I'm a corporate lawyer. I'm not an expert in public education. I would just say that along with what we learned from the desegregation era, there are lessons about accommodating people of different races within the public schools. It's something that has to be done. And there are lessons that can be learned, and perhaps some of those lessons have not been learned or have been forgotten because we still have the same set of problems. By the same token, I would say that we can't expect the schools to solve all those problems either. And that's kind of a non-answer, but I think it raises some of the issues that we need to keep in mind. And certainly the schools need to work harder to accommodate different races in schools. And perhaps there are some lessons to be learned from those who faced those same problems back during desegregation.
Thank you. It is a society problem. Yeah.
I'd like to say something. My grandson just finished 3 years at Lincoln High School. He was in the magnet program. He's white. He was one of 2 or 3 white boys on the Lincoln basketball team. And I went to a number of basketball games at Lincoln where my daughters had gone many years ago with John Spindler as principal. And I really got a kick out of it because it was old home week for Black families. There were babies in arms who couldn't even walk. There were little toddlers. There were parents. There were grandparents. It was a wonderful gathering of the Black community at those basketball games. And we whites were very much in the minority, I can guarantee you. It was a very interesting experience. Everybody got along fine, thank goodness. With looking towards the future though, we have in Alachua County now a unique situation with 3 Black females on the school board. There are 5 seats on the school board. 3 are now held by Blacks. They are going to tackle rezoning of the schools that is long overdue. There also are questions connected to that about establishing a school for a vocational school in Alachua County, or using one of these schools to teach vocational, and then trying to make people understand that that's a good thing to use rather than a detrimental program for kids who are acting up, for instance. So I think the next 2 years are going to be a time of tremendous change in our school system. And it behooves all of us to keep an eye on what's going on. I think we're going to have to do it with the television set more than the newspaper, because the Gainesville Sun is not covering the school system as it used to. And so it's going to be harder to find out what's going on. But this is a critical period in our school history.
Well, I would certainly agree with that. And I also have been watching the school board meetings on TV, on the computer, actually. It's possible to download those meetings.
Oh, okay.
And I was the beneficiary of Gainesville Sun coverage because it was covered on a daily basis.
Yeah.
I didn't stop to talk about sources, but the Gainesville Sun is an incredible source. Cliff Cormier was the education editor of the Gainesville Sun during those years. And I was able to read 11 years on microfilm at the University of Florida. And at that time, the microfilm machines were set up so that I could copy each article. And I have my files, which will, the special collections at the University of Florida Library wants my files because they just don't exist in any other form elsewhere. But I would agree with you that the Sun is not even remotely, although they're certainly expressing a lot of opinions, they're not giving us a lot of facts.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mary Nutter, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question.
I just want to follow up with what Margaret was talking about the present situation with the school board. You can follow the school board meetings, as was mentioned, on Zoom and on your computer. The editorial in today's paper did cover the present fight over segregating and desegregating and closing the school, if you will, Michael. They're trying to determine what population will go to the new elementary school on the west side of town, and they want to close Terwilliger School. And the families of the children who are going to be melded into the new elementary school on the west side of town have been speaking to the school board, and they don't want to go to school with those children. And the editorial board, thankfully, has taken a position that these parents need to reconsider their attitude, and the school board needs to look at how the school is going to be successfully integrated from Terwilliger and the new school. Coincidentally, our interim superintendent, who is doing an excellent job handling this problem that was kicked down the road for several years by the other school board members and the superintendent, has talked about how the two schools, Terwilliger and the feeder school children, are comparable. But the perception of the families is that these families will be integrated with children those children that have behavior and academic problems, and it's patently untrue. So we're about to face another one, and Michael, you might want to research that while you're at it.
I plan to retire from being an author, but thank you for the good thoughts.
Any other questions or comments? John Spindler, if you'd like to share anything.
Well, I knew this subject will spur a lot of your questions and your inquiries, especially in the second week. The first week last week was mostly facts and figures about the development of the mandates. But I've listened, and I'm going to refrain here from all my stories because they go on and on. A lot of war stories from being principal during that process at time in our school system. But Mike, you've done a marvelous job, and I hope that you'll lend support to the public schools in the way you have in the past, and continue to look at the present situation and do some reporting. I understand your hesitancy to be a person analyzing and making opinions because you haven't been trained that way with your background in corporate law. But hang in there. We do need facts rather than opinions necessarily ruling the school board's administration of the problems that we face. Julianne, I think that will conclude our program today. We're over our time limit. Thank you to all the residents at Okamic who participated today. We're glad you were here. And Also to Julianne for facilitating.
Thank you all.
And I
for
want to
being with
thank
us.
everyone also for their comments and for recognizing that this is a problem that requires more attention.
Thank you all. Join us next week for Fletcher Crow's presentation, The Black History of the Gainesville Area. Thank you all. Stay well.